Well, good morning, and welcome to the Church Online Communications Comprehensive. My name is Peter Frank, and this is our 14th and final session of this 14-week training course. So I'm happy to be here. It's crazy how fast it's gone, and that we're wrapping up this week. I hope you have been able to participate all the way through. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned some things from this comprehensive. I know I've had a lot of fun putting these materials together and working with my team to get out all the blog posts and the downloads and the presentations, and I keep getting great feedback, so thank you for that. As we wrap up today, we're going to take a brief look at how to wrap up your communication strategy. We'll wrap up this course at the same time you're hopefully finishing your plan, or at least you have an idea of where you want to go. So that is our topic for today. We will be doing some question and answers, so I hope you're able to participate with that. If you see me looking down at my phone, I'm going to hopefully get the answers in this time, or the questions in. I've had some problems seeing those on my desktop screen, so Q&A doesn't work too well if I don't see the questions. So let's go into a little bit of the housekeeping items first. So again, my name is Peter Frank. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager of Church Supplies at Concordia Publishing House. And my contact information is on the screen for you one last time. I do thank all of those who have taken advantage of reaching out and let me know what's going on in your church, how you are using digital or online communication tools. It's been great to hear that, and it has certainly given me ideas for additional content in the future, or some of it I've already shared here in the comprehensive. So if you have not reached out to me, don't hesitate to do that in the future. I'd love to hear more, especially in a few weeks and months as you are implementing your communication strategy. That's when I'm really excited to hear how it's going. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Today's topic, again, it's session 14. It's sharing excitement about your communication strategy. And our plan is to answer the question, how do we pull it all together and get others on board? We've gone through a lot of materials over the last 13 weeks. In this 14th week, we'll talk about how do you get it out there, how do you get it out and implement it in your congregation. And so we're going to follow a little bit different format today. I mentioned Q&As. I've got a number of questions that I have written that I'm going to answer for you. I've got a series of questions that people in the course have asked and either posted on the Facebook channel or emailed me. I think most of these have come from Facebook, either from the videos or from our private group as well. And so I'll be sure to answer those today. And then I'd also ask that if you have questions, you go ahead and put them in the chat when you're thinking about it. I'll try to get to as many as I can, depending on how many there are. I can't guarantee I'll get to all of them. And we'll try to keep this closer to 45 minutes or so today. But let's go ahead and get started. So we will jump into the outline, a brief outline today. So first, we're going to talk about how do you pull it all together? How do you take what we've learned in these last 13 weeks and put it in place? How do you roll out your strategy in your congregation? And we'll wrap up with some question and answers. All right, so let's begin. The first question that we're going to answer today about pulling it all together is, what does the strategy actually look like? In other words, what's the deliverable? And we've talked about deliverables in a variety of ways. Last week it was about making sure that you cut off your work at a point where you can deliver it or ship it. I think as one of our attendees put, ship. And that's a great way to think about it, is when do you say, okay, I've done an appropriate amount of work, let's get it out there. Same kind of thing can occur with your communication strategy. You can tweak it and update it and improve it. At a certain point, you have to say, okay, it's good, we're going to roll it out and start using it, and we'll make adjustments as we go. But what does that actually look like? I know for many of you, it may just be a concept right now, and maybe some notes that you've jotted down. For others, I know you've started working on it, started documenting it, and for others, you may be ready to go and looking at what you've all put together and say, all right, let's get this moving. So the deliverable can vary to a certain extent. What I would like you to do is actually document it, and it could be with just words, it could be with diagrams or images or other things. How professional looking you want to make it, or professional looking, it's always going to be professional if you're putting time on it. but how polished it looks. That's probably a better word. Will certainly depend on your skills and your ability to pull these things together in a more of a designed manner. I have a team of designers who work with me here at CPH, and so I get a lot of help from them. But let me show you one of our free downloads today. I'll give you a sneak peek. We have here an online communication strategy template. I'm going to switch the view so you can see it. It's a free Word document, and it's something that it's not a real in-depth template for you because it will really vary based on your church and what you want to include in here. But this includes the things that we've discussed the last 13 weeks. And so you can see here that it's a place to plug in your church name and your date. There will be instructions throughout. One thing that I did include in here is what Microsoft calls Smart Art. And so it's normally when you'd add it, you'd go into Insert and click Smart Art, depending on which version of Word you have. And there's all sorts of different graphs and stuff. And so I picked out some ideal ones that I would recommend you use, but don't feel like you have to stick with this. The downloads that we have shared throughout these 14 weeks have been designed in Adobe InDesign, and they're very customized for our needs. They're meant to give you an idea. This is the same thing, although it's not as customized as more out of the box from Microsoft Word. It allows you to use those tools that are in place from a design standpoint and just put your text in there as you go. And so you'll notice these are very common things we've gone back to time and time again: goals and personas. Here's a very simple template for persona profiles. Journey maps, we give you 3 starting points there, message maps. So I won't go through all of these details, but what I would recommend is you have some kind of document where you will describe what the strategy of each of these things is. So like we landed on content map. So take some time and in a paragraph or 2, describe what the content map of your church looks like. And then if you feel comfortable doing it, and that's why we put it in here, go ahead and manipulate the Smart Art to match your needs. And you can easily add additional ones as you go and expand it, and each one works a little bit different. So it's a starting point. You've got all the different shape options in there. I can't go into great detail about how to use each one of these, but they're a starting point for you. So when we talk about an actual deliverable, that's what I would say is have a digital and or printed document, depending on your preference or who you're rolling it out to. Have a document that you can share that describes your strategy. And understand that this is not going to be a one-time thing where you put your strategy together and you use it for the next 5 years. Things are certainly going to change, but at least this gives you a starting point. And if you put it in a format like this, it's easy to update as needed. So another option you could do is you could put it in a PowerPoint, because PowerPoints are easily exported to PDFs. You can print them. There's some additional design tools within there, and there's lots of PowerPoint templates available that are a little bit more polished than like a Word document. So that's one way to do it as well. And if you go really creative, if you have the skill set and the tools, then I would say do a fully designed one using Adobe InDesign or something like that. That's for the advanced people. That's for the people who have the time to focus all their energy on communications and maybe have a team that works on them for things like that. I know that not a lot of churches will have an on-staff copywriter or designer, but some of the larger ones do. And so if you're one of those congregations that's blessed to have that kind of skill level, then be sure to take advantage of it, because your communication strategy is obviously an important stepping stone for all of your other communication. And if your strategy is well thought through and well designed, then your communication will be as well. So, all right, let's switch to the next question. This one goes back to something we talked about at the beginning in terms of why we're doing this. How do I accommodate all the communication preferences of my audiences? Or of my audience, I should say. And that one is, that's a big question, and there's no right answer to it. It really depends on how many communication preferences your audience has. I will tell you, I don't think you'll be able to accommodate all of them unless you have a large staff. But that doesn't mean you can't start moving in that direction. If you have one single way of communicating with people right now, or two, maybe you just add another one. And so what that'll do is it'll show your congregation members, your visitors, your audience, that you are keeping in mind that preferences are changing, that there's more than one way to communicate. And even if you don't hit all of the communication preferences, you're moving in that direction. And that means that they'll move a little bit closer to you as well. I mean, if they see you putting the effort to reach out to them in multiple ways, they'll be more willing to look for that information and maybe a way that's not their immediate preference. So if you have a high schooler who only wants to use Snapchat or Instagram, and you're not at that point yet where you can do Snapchat, but maybe you could do Instagram, you get a little closer together. So that's an oversimplification of the process. But my caution for you is to make sure that you're not trying to be all things for all people right from the beginning. Take steps in that direction, and that'll be a good point of showing that you're understanding that these preferences have changed. So there is that question. The next question, in terms of pulling it all together, how do I keep the strategy updated with the latest trends in communication? And I hear this a lot and in different ways. How do I stay up to date on the latest trends in communication? How do I learn about this? Now, that's a little bit different than how do you learn about specific ones. So that one's really easy. If you want to learn, let's say, about emails or social media in a broad sense, or maybe certain channels in a specific sense, just go to Google and start searching through it. There's so much free stuff out there. But if you are looking for the latest trends and you want to stay up to date, here's a few recommendations I have for you. First off, follow some of the big players in communication. And the three that I look at a lot are Facebook and really Mark Zuckerberg. I follow him, the founder of Facebook. I follow him on Facebook, and a lot of the things that he shares is talking about where digital tools, I won't say just communication, but where technology is headed. And specifically for him, he talks a lot about Facebook, as you might expect. But even more so, just the latest technology and how that's going to shape our world more so than just social media. So there's been, he had a great presentation at their F8 conference several months back now about augmented reality and virtual reality and what that could mean from a Facebook standpoint, which fits right into communications, and machine learning and things like that. All of that is stuff that's started now and is coming up, and it's fascinating to think through how we can use that in the church. And so we can take a few steps back and say, okay, where are we at right now? That's coming in months or years. Where are we at right now that we can start preparing for that? And so, as Zuckerberg talks about augmented reality on Facebook, or virtual reality on Facebook, both of those are things that they're working towards. Then you can start thinking, okay, how do I build a following on Facebook? How do I get my audience engaged on Facebook so that when these tools become available, I'm ready to start using them with a built-in audience? So that's what I'm talking about as you look at the latest trends in technology, is see how it ties into what you're doing or could be doing right now. So another one that I go to all the time is HubSpot. HubSpot is an inbound marketing company that provides a software that we use for our digital marketing, and is just is really fantastic. They have a couple blogs. Their marketing blog is what I would recommend for communication people, but they provide a lot of great information on how to use these tools. Now, they're doing it certainly from a business perspective, but you can use them and the content they share from a knowledge of the tool sort of perspective. They're not going to give you advice on church, and that's okay, because often when it comes to technology in the church has to set the pace for how it's going to be used. It can't be the same way as in business. And usually there's not others outside the church recommending it. And so you get to be the one to say, okay, in my context, once I understand this tool, how could it help me, or can it even help me? So HubSpot's a great place to learn about the tools. On their social media, specifically on Facebook or Instagram, they've been posting a lot of videos that are much more timely than their blog posts. I really have enjoyed watching their videos and hearing about the latest trends. There's some stuff in there that doesn't really apply or won't be useful to you, so you kind of have to sift through that. But like when, I'll go back to F8, when Zuckerberg was talking about it, his speech was quite a bit of time, 20, 30 minutes or more. And HubSpot did a quick 3 or 4 minute video just recapping it, maybe not even that long. So it's a way to stay in touch with it and just get the gist of it without having to dig in entirely. So depending on how much time you have, that might be a better option. And the last one on their Social Media Examiner, you can just Google them. They've got a great email that goes out every day, and I can't keep up with it because there's so much great information in there. But they're focused, of course, as the name would imply, on social media. But they often have the latest and greatest in social media too. So those are what I would recommend. Each of them will have ties outside of their primary area. So HubSpot will have a lot on best practices on web design. Social Media Examiner will tie into digital advertising as well, mostly in social, again, as you'd expect. But those are what I'd recommend. From a church perspective, there's 2 Facebook groups that I follow most when it comes to hearing how people are utilizing these new tools in their ministry. And that's Lutheran Communicators and Church Communications. Now, if you are a Lutheran Communicators is the way to go. It's led by Seth Hins of the Michigan District of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and it really targets the audience to those in Lutheran churches, which makes it work really well if you are in that audience, because our churches operate in a different kind of theology, a different size than many of the mega churches and the like. And so I like that one. It's also just enough posts and interaction to keep me engaged but not be overwhelming, because there's regular posts all the time, but it's not like a flood of information. Now, if you want a flood of information, I would recommend going to the Church Communications group. And I forgot how many thousands of people they're up to now. They just hit a milestone. I don't remember what milestone it was. I think it's 10,000. But that is churches of all different shapes and sizes, and there's a lot of content that comes through there. It often overwhelms my news feed. There's so much. So that is kind of like drinking from a fire hose, but you can learn a lot from them. So I'm not directly affiliated or overseeing any of these. These are just my personal preferences for staying in touch. And of course, there's plenty of others. These sources will link to other things, and you can find some of the best ones. What I tend to find is if there's an interesting post or blog post or article or something, I'll follow them on Facebook or Instagram for a while and just see, do they post things that are this interesting all the time, and maybe stick with them. And once I get bored, then I'll unfollow, just so it doesn't clutter up things. But it's a good strategy to have, at least for me. Hopefully that would work for you too. All right, let's move into the next question. We've answered this several times, but I'm going to talk about it one more time because it's so important. How do I find time to put a communication strategy together? And I dig into this a little bit in today's blog post. I like to refer to the silly joke, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I use that phrase quite a bit because that's really what it feels like when you're talking about a communication strategy. There's so much you can do. And of course, the strategy part is not planned out in your day-to-day time. You have enough things to fill your day-to-day time without adding on this huge project. But what I recommend is just start little, start doing a few things at a time. It may take you a year to get through it. It may take you more than a year. But don't be discouraged because you can't complete it quickly. Just take the steps that you need to make progress. Every little bit that you add to your plan, even if it's just through a mental strategy, the more you think through this and start changing your behavior to be very strategic, to be redundant there, the better you're going to be. But if you have nothing else, and that's where I want to add to this today, if you do nothing else, do these 3 things. First, identify your church's goals. And I put identify there because if you don't have church goals already established, establishing church goals is a lengthy process. But if you don't have them established, you can at least identify them based on the actions, the events, the direction that your church is headed. That is publicly available. I mean, certainly if you're on the church staff, you're going to know these things anyways. But just where the attention of the church is at, by looking at that, you can have a general idea of what the goals of your church are. So first identify that. Then determine at least 2 personas. So rather than thinking of, this is the type of person we're communicating with, just think of 2 different types of people. It's not too hard. It's almost oversimplifying that. But if you have people who are longtime members and you have younger members who have not been here 50 years because they haven't been alive 50 years, split that group and say, okay, here are my 2 personas, and just do it strictly by age and separate it by 50 and above or less. That's one way to do it, but at least what you're doing there is you're starting to segment your audience, and then you can start to communicate differently with them and test things out and try it and see what works and what doesn't work. Just those baby steps to start off. The last thing I would recommend you do is to draft a journey map. This doesn't have to be real detailed. It doesn't have to be exact. We've talked a lot about how your journey map should have outward actions that are taken by your audience that you can track. Many times you have to set up that tracking. When I say draft a journey map, when I say draft a journey map, I don't mean plan out all of those and set the tracking in place. Just start to have the idea of how do people get to these goals that we've already identified in that first step. So those 3 things are it. If you can do nothing else, do these 3 things. And that's something that you can do in 15, 20, 30 minutes. Even if you're not writing things down, if you just think through that, maybe take your lunch break, and while you're eating, just start jotting a few things down, or just start thinking through this. That's the bare minimum to get started. And I think that'll encourage you and excite you enough to move forward with other things and dig deeper into each of these 3, obviously, and then all the other things that we've talked about. So that is the last real thing in how do you pull it all together. There's additional information in our blog post and in our free download for today, but I really want to move into the next step, which is more the theme for today, is how do you share your excitement about it? How do you roll it out into your church, with your church staff, with your volunteers, with your members? What does that look like? So let's dig into the first question with that, and that's the broad question of how do I introduce the strategy? Now, as with most things we've discussed, it will certainly depend on your congregation and what your situation looks like. That's to be expected. But what I would recommend doing, and this is different than many other marketing type campaigns, communication, marketing, they're very related. But when I think marketing and a big new initiative, I think of branding. And maybe it's a new logo and a new style sheet and a style guide and all of that. That kind of thing really requires a definitive point in time that you say, okay, moving forward, this is our brand. This is our brand identity. And you'll want some definite cutoffs. Okay, don't use this old logo anymore. We're going to have new letterhead. We're going to update our website. We're going to do new signage. From a rebranding perspective, that certainly requires a point in time where you're saying, okay, now we're moving forward. With a online communications strategy, you don't have to be as strict about that rollout and say, this is something we're going to do in phases. Okay, first we're going to start looking at it based on church goals. And all of our communication is going to be held up against this list of goals and say, do these communication efforts support these goals? And if not, we're going to cut them. And then you roll into doing personas and say, okay, we're going to identify our target audiences. And here's how we're going to communicate with them. And so you can do this over a period of time. I'd also recommend that you start talking about this now. If you are wanting to introduce a new strategy and wanting to implement it in your church, start talking about it, because there's no harm in talking about doing things differently. And you'll often get a lot of good ideas. You can start to generate some excitement and maybe even some impatience when you've been talking about it and then you fall back into old habits or somebody else does things the way you used to do them. You'll start to see some antsiness about, okay, this doesn't feel right. We've talked about why we're going to be moving in this direction. Let's just do it now. Maybe you'll hear that or feel that the next time you send a mass email out to everybody that could have been segmented, and you'll start thinking, okay, I should have taken the time to segment this list and be a little bit more specific for each audience. So as you introduce it, it doesn't have to be a formal training, sit down and here's the document, read through it, we're going to have a quiz after that. That doesn't usually work because for most people in the church, communications are an afterthought. You're in the position you're in, or you're here today because it's not an afterthought for you. And surely you've recognized that you think about communications a little bit differently than everybody else. And so keep that in mind as you roll it out, that it's important to understand their perspective. They're not going to be as excited about this as you are. But if you start introducing the reasons why you're doing it and how you're going to do it, and that it's not going to be a burden on them, that it's going to be maybe more work on your part, or certainly a different way of doing it on your part, they just need to understand what and why you're doing it. That's going to help. So that kind of leads into the next question on here of when should I introduce it? Like I suggested, you may want to start talking about it now, even if you're not ready to introduce it, just to get that idea out. But what I would recommend in terms of if you are going for more of a sharing of your strategy, which I think should be done at a certain point, focus on doing that ahead of a big change in your church. And when I say big change, I don't mean like wait for the new pastor to come along, if that's your situation. No, I mean like the start of the school year. Often schools and churches are tied together. We are starting a new initiative at our church right after Labor Day. That's a good time to, ahead of that, roll out, okay, this is the strategy, the communication strategy moving forward. Or maybe it's a new year and you tie that into the idea of resolutions or something like that, but say, okay, moving into 2018, here's how we're going to change our communications. We're going to focus on these audiences, these goals. We're going to lead people down this journey. Or maybe you do that at the beginning of the summer and you spend this year working through the details, finalizing it, testing out a few things, and then come June you say, okay, we've wrapped up this year, we're looking ahead to the summer. This summer, while things are slower, we're going to start shifting our communications, and by the time fall comes around, we're going to be fully into this. So tying a time frame to it is important, but when you do it is not as important as the fact that you do have this plan of how you're going to roll it out. Do it in phases, tie it to something that makes logical sense in your church, and start doing it. Other things like seasonal things like Advent or Lent, you may say, okay, for this effort, for Advent, as we're communicating our midweek services and the Christmas programs that come with it, we're going to do things a little bit different this time around. That might be a good way to do it too. So hopefully that answers the question for you of when you should introduce it. It's not a specific answer, but it should help you. All right, now we'll start getting into some of the less comfortable things. How do I encourage the church staff and volunteers to follow the communication strategy? So what happens when you have explained all of why you're doing this, and you roll it out, and you encourage the church staff to do it, and they still fall into old habits? Maybe it's a mass email to everybody. I go back to that a lot because that always pains me when I see it. Well, just send this to the entire list. That's when you start to struggle with, okay, am I the only one who cares about doing this in the right way? And that's going to be tough, and I encourage you to stick with it because it's the right thing to do. As you are implementing this new strategy, your focus is on your audience and on your message and allowing those two to connect better. That's a very good and worthy goal. And so anything outside of that is either ignoring the importance of the message or ignoring the importance of your audience. So as you, if you find that others on your church staff or your volunteers don't care about what you're doing or don't follow it, gently remind them why you're doing it. And it's to make sure that your communication is more effective, that it reaches the right people and in the right manner. Because communication without purpose is just noise, and we're getting away from noise and making it be meaningful messages. So how do you encourage the church staff? Well, just through regular communication. Talk with them about it regularly and say, okay, here's why we're sending this to these people and not to others. Here's why we're posting on this channel but not on this one. As you explain the reason behind it, these things will start to become second nature to you, and they'll start to anticipate that as well. And I've seen that with the team here at CPH. We've been moving in this direction for 2 to 3 years now. And it's a little uncomfortable at first, but once you start doing it and you start seeing the results, and that's where certain metrics come into play, like, oh, look how many reactions we got on this post. Look how many people have shared this, or how many people clicked on this email. Those things start to build up that excitement. And then if you always point back to, okay, well, this worked. We had a 50% open rate on this email because we cut out half of our list who probably wasn't going to open it anyways. And so if we kept with that original number, we'd get the same people to open it, but it'd only be 25%. And we would have wasted that other half of the audience's time. So as you start tying this back in, explain why you're doing, explain what happened, what was successful, and then if you have some, and then we're going to get into this in a minute, if it doesn't work, you can start evaluating it from there and making changes in the future. So making sure people see how it fits into the big picture and turns into good and valuable results will encourage them. And I pray that will work well for you. There will be situations where no matter what you do, some people won't get on board. And that's okay, because it's not, the goal is not to get everybody on board. The goal is to improve your communication. And you can do that without everybody on board. All right, I think I've touched on that topic too much, because it also flows into this next one. What if the rest of the church staff or volunteers are not supportive? And so rather than just encouraging them to use it, if people are ignoring it, what if people are specifically saying, no, we're not going to do it that way? Well, certainly communication is the key. Again, explain to them why you're doing it this way. And you can kind of get buy-in as you go. And you can say, okay, this message is important, right? Right. This audience is important, and this is the audience we're targeting, right? Yeah. Okay, the best way to reach this audience with this message is through this because of X, Y, and Z. And if you explain that and get that buy-in, then say, okay, so what are you struggling with here as to why we are doing it this way? What is it that makes you uncomfortable? And if they can't verbalize it, then they'll hopefully they'll see that, okay, this is the right direction. If they can verbalize it, well, then maybe there's something to learn there. I've seen more often than not that those who are most uncomfortable with how we are changing our communication are often in the segment of our audience that is being left out or being intentionally excluded from that message. And it's just this act of exclusion. And so I'll give an example. When we rolled out a young adult Bible study at my congregation, and we specifically communicated with the young adults, the 35 and under crowd, we had some individuals in their 40s who were upset about that. And it wasn't that they were upset that we were communicating with the 35 and under crowd. It was that they didn't have something for people of their age range. And so it came out in a different way than you might expect. It wasn't, well, where's our Bible study, or what we can do. It was, well, why are you focusing on the young people? And so after some dialogue and communication, it's like, okay, well, the root problem isn't how we're communicating this. It's the fact that we're missing this audience over here. And so having that dialogue and explaining it, you may not be able to solve the root problem in that conversation, but at least you can point to what it is. So that would be my recommendation. These situations are obviously tough and varied depending on your setting. So that is part of it. Okay, next up, what if the strategy isn't effective? And this is probably the biggest fear that you have going into this. What if this doesn't work? What if my new strategy bombs and I get worse engagement than I had before? Well, certainly that's a big fear. I don't think it's a legitimate fear, because if you do your due diligence, you're looking at what you are already doing and improving upon it, in many cases replacing it, but not without valid reasons. You're not saying, all right, we're getting rid of the print newsletter and we're moving everything to Twitter just because we can. I'm sure you're not doing that. If you are doing that, then you haven't paid attention, though, for the last 14 weeks. So if it bombs, then that means that you've probably had a misstep somewhere along the way. Or maybe it's not that you had a misstep, it's that you didn't dialogue with your audience enough to understand what they were looking for. And so it gives you an opportunity to go back, reevaluate, try some new things. And that's why I recommend starting quickly, learning how failure is not bad, it's educational, and making those changes as you go. If your strategy fails, if that's how you view it, then you probably haven't implemented a very detailed strategy, because your strategy it'll have many different tracks to it, and certain paths might fail, but others should succeed, and so it allows you to optimize. And that goes into our next question of, what next? After I roll this out, what do I do next? Well, I encourage you, first and foremost, if you're asking this question, be patient, because it's not a quick process. You can't put this together over 3 months, implement it, and say, okay, now what do I do? Because it's an ongoing process, and that's where it becomes very iterative, and that you introduce it, and you test things, and you improve it, and you try something new. I would be very surprised if you can try everything new at once. Because then you may have just too much time on your hands, and I have yet to hear that from anybody, that they have too much time on their hands. But the next step really just becomes optimization and improving it and trying new things. And with the way technology is changing, there's always something new to try. So if you get to the point where you are bored with your communication strategy and asking what's next, then it's either because you didn't do a very holistic plan, or maybe communications isn't the right place for you because you're bored with it. There's always something coming up next that can be improved on and tested and tried. So the next step for a congregation after getting good processes in place for the communication strategy is to figure out, are there additional audiences that we can reach? How do we grow our ministry? And I'm sure you already know that is that is where most churches want to go, is to expand and get the gospel into different hands than what you have already been doing once you have those processes in place. So it's, in my mind, a little bit of a silly question, but I have been asked that before, and it's a logical question to ask because many people want to see, what is that long-term plan? Yes, we may plan to focus on our strategy for a year. What do we do next year? And so there's some legitimacy in there, but just know that the next step is generally pretty logical if you do the steps in front of it well. Okay. Now is the time where we're going to switch gears and talk to you. So I would ask that if you have any questions, let me switch. There we go. If you have any questions, go ahead and enter them into the chat now. And while you're at it, if you want to put where you're watching from, if you maybe indicate how many of these sessions you've watched. If it's your first session and you ask a question, I may refer you back to a different session. But otherwise, as you ask those questions, things that you're not quite sure on that we've covered, go ahead and put them in now. I'm going to go through several questions that we've had from other people who have watched and participated, and answer those as we go. And that way it gives you a little bit of time to ask your questions. As I'm looking at our audience, we're a little bit lighter than normal. We've noticed this trend as we've gotten into August. There seemed to be a very a sharp turn in number of people attending in August, and I think that has to do with the start of the school year and start of new ministries at the church. So that's to be expected. So we probably won't have tons of questions, but I do encourage those of you who are watching to go ahead and plug something in. All right, first question that came up in our Facebook group this week, as I asked for what people were thinking. Stephen, went the wrong direction. Stephen asked this question. There are parts of what you've presented that have already been extremely beneficial, and others that I'm seriously struggling with. To what extent is it necessary to put all the pieces of the plan in place? What, if any, could be implemented piecemeal? And I have to apologize or confess up front that I had read this question as I was developing it, and I wanted to answer that question of the amount of time before. And so I'll jump back to that real quickly just so you can see it one more time. Those 3 things that I recommend that you do. Oops, where did that go? We'll switch there. There we are. If you do nothing else, here are the things that I think you could piecemeal in, as the phrase was used. Identify your church's goals, determine at least 2 personas, and draft a journey map. Those, I think, are the most important things as you are pulling your plan together to that you can do without much other actions. But certainly as you go through it, you can take baby steps in each of those areas and try it out a little bit. So if content mapping seems like a big process because you have to have your journey map in place, your audiences defined, and then putting a piece of content at each stage for each audience, that's a lot of work. Certainly that's not going to be a one-day project. Maybe not even a one-day project to come up with the ideas. Definitely not to implement those ideas. But you can start mapping that out. And even if it's just a list of ideas that say, when somebody joins the church, this would be a great article for them to read. Or this would be a great way to explain to them how our worship service means, or some of the terms that we use. Things like that. If you have ideas that maybe not are fully developed, go ahead and jot them down and start coming up with them. You can piece them together later. And if they don't fit quite right, you can adjust them so that they do. So that would be my advice to you, Stephen, is that as you're going through, do these 3 things first and foremost. And based on other conversations that we've had in the group, I know he's moving in the right direction. But it's not entirely necessary to have everything in place at the beginning. In fact, I would recommend not going that route of thinking you have everything in place before you start, but to start out trying things so that you can improve them and move on to the next thing. Okay, so the next question that we've got here, this was from a little while ago. Lisa said, even though we know the medium is not the message, people often behave or feel as if it is. How do we work around that? How do we catechize both the lurking Luddites and the technologically savvy, reminding us all that we are all part of one church? And a church is the one that is in Christ, not geographically or temporally bound. And I had some struggle reading those words. Thanks for your patience as I got through that. That's a very good question. As we look at our audiences and understand that technology is an aspect of what we're doing, and in getting even farther, as she says, the medium is not the message. Sorry, I just had a Chrome error. I'm hoping that didn't interrupt my broadcast at all. So it doesn't look like it did. Sorry about that. Anytime I get those error messages while I'm live, it makes me a little nervous. But going back to the question, the technology itself is not the goal. The individual mediums, Facebook or Instagram or your blog, those are not the goal either. Your goal is to connect the message with the audience. And so as you are doing that, certainly you must understand that the audience should be the whole. And as you are communicating with your audience, with the members, emphasizing that there is a place for each of them, that this is, anytime you segment the message, you're not excluding people, you're focusing on certain areas. That will help them see what their role is. The church is a body of many members. And so seeing how that all works together, certainly explaining what you're doing as you go. And I mentioned that before, as sometimes there will be, if you are segmenting your message very well. So, for example, the young adult events are only being communicated to the young adults. And you have an older audience that says, well, are we not doing anything to focus on young families? You might want to inform them of what's all going on, but change how you communicate that message. So rather saying, we're inviting everybody to come to our 20s and 30s Bible study. You could say, or you could do instead to the older audience, say, if you happen to know anyone who's in their 20s or 30s, be sure to invite them to our young adult Bible study. And so you're changing the message a little bit. It's not about would you like to attend, but you're saying would anybody like to attend. It involves them in an appropriate manner. So it shows that we're all still part of that same body of believers, but we have different roles. When you're in your 70s, your role is not to attend the young adult Bible study, but your role is to support them and encourage those young adults that you know. So I hope that answers it. The latter part, not geographically or temporally bound, understanding that we are part of the larger body of believers, and that our call is to share the gospel to all nations. Understanding that technology gives us a reach farther outside our immediate community. You can grow your ministry outside the neighborhood, if you will. And so that is, I think, a question that you can talk about and explain. I think you'll have to make sure you keep your focus where you're called and see the possible advantages of going outside that, but not make that your focus to reach people in all countries if you have a great opportunity in the community that you're in. Okay, so next question. And good, I see some comments are coming through. Thank you for that. The next question is from Kelly. She asks, what's a good way to learn all the details of your congregation as you're assigning members to the personas? This is from pretty much near the beginning of our course, as we talked about assigning personas. And this is a fun one that has many different answers. But as we talk about storing information and assigning personas to your people, there's several different ways you can do that. Surveys are a good way to do that. We do that here at CPH regularly and ask people as surveys. And it's a lot of questions at one time, and maybe you put a reward on that. For everybody who fills out the survey, we'd love to give you this free bookmark or something like that. It doesn't have to be a great reward. But just some little encouragement to say, we value this information. We're going to use it well. Conversations are a key part of that too, and that's a long game. But as you're talking with people, asking them different questions. Certainly as you're sharing content online, if you're putting in Bible study notes and you want to maybe ask them a question before that, you'll see that with newspapers and many other things. We do that here at CTS all the time to just get a little bit of additional information. Chances are if you've downloaded one of our free downloads, you've had to put in what role in the church you're at. That just helps us segment our audience even more. And while it may seem like you're prying for information, what you're really trying to do is just be more relevant to them. So that would be something that I would recommend. Even just asking people to fill out a form, electronically or in print, and explain why you're doing it. Just say, we'd love to hear your communication preferences. Are you on Facebook or Twitter? And if so, what are your handles? Those kind of things. Just asking. So like I said, that's a tough task. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Each congregation is going to be different. It's best to tack onto something that's already in your process. So, if every year you have people sign up for Sunday school, you may ask the parents a few more questions at that time. And if people sign up for Bible study, you may ask them a few more questions. But understanding what you're going to ask them is key first, so that you're not wasting their time with questions that you're never going to utilize the results from. Okay. Next question that we've got comes from Jackie. She said, does condition of membership informing someone that joining the organization, giving us your email, is that automatic permission to email? Constitute legal obtaining permission, especially when we also provide an opt-out process with every email? In many ways it is. It's my knowledge of the law in this area is a little bit sketchy. And so I always try to err on the side of caution and say, would you like to receive emails? And just be very blunt about that, because then you've got yourself covered. If you are stating, would you like to receive emails? For one, you got it yourself covered on the legal side. Two, you're informing people, we will be sending emails. Is this something you want? And three, you get to exclude people who don't want your emails. Just because you want to communicate with them in that manner doesn't mean they will want to. And if they don't want to, it certainly is not going to be effective. And that's sometimes a tough thing to get in mind. Like, well, as long as we have their email, we can let them know. Well, in that case, if they don't want to be communicated over email and you're still saying, well, this is my preferred way of communicating with you, you're missing the point entirely, because they're not going to read the emails. They're not going to receive the message that you want them to receive, and that's the entire point. So I would be very blunt about it. In terms of does it actually constitute that, I'm not entirely sure. But I think the best way to do it is to be very blunt and ask, and that way you can ensure that, yes, if all of you, if you're in the church, have this idea of membership, where, okay, members of the church, we're willing to, we can communicate with you in that way. Well, the only way you can communicate with them is if they give you that email, and if they're giving you that email, there's this implicit understanding that that you want to receive email. So I would say just make sure to add a little checkbox or something, or if you're just starting off and you want to cover your bases, just ask people in church, if you'd like to receive emails from us, please go ahead and submit this form online with your latest email and put the checkbox on there. So there's a lot of different ways. I could get into that in more detail, but we've got a few more questions I want to go. This is another one from Kelly. She asked, specific question about downloadable print resources from our website regarding pastors perhaps not wanting their content to be out there. How can we protect the intellectual property of our pastors? And certainly this goes into copyrights and digital ownership. And I think I did answer this at least in print or maybe live. But I think the key is when you're talking about protecting this, what are you protecting? If your pastor is going for his PhD and is putting together a dissertation, that's probably not something that you want to share online in progress or in its entirety when it's done, just because of the proprietary information, the work that went into that. But that's also not really advancing the gospel, most likely not, in the way that your goals are set up. So if you are putting together content for your goals, then certainly you want to get it out there. And so I would be cautious to say focus on why you're doing this. And if the goal is to accomplish church goals, to spread the gospel, the more people who have it, the better. If it's so important to not be shared elsewhere, then there might be information in there that can be excluded without removing the whole thing. So that's how I would respond to that. I think it's important, certainly, to protect the intellectual rights. And as a publisher, obviously, we respect that very much. That's a very important part of what we do here. And so at the church level, focus on what you're doing in your role in terms of sharing the gospel and making that as shareable as possible. You can do the appropriate things of putting a copyright line on there. I'd say, owned by the pastor, copyright 2017 pastor so-and-so. Those are things that are pretty simple to do and add a little bit of legal coverage on there so that people don't just steal it. But I would also say put it in a form that is able to be shared and give credit back. So social media posts with quotes and have your church name on it. It's a lot more work to go in and remove those things from a post before sharing it than to just share it. And the right people who you want sharing will do it without stealing it. And if they steal it, then you have to just pray that the Lord will still use the message to reach the hearts of the people who see it. All right, a couple more questions as we wrap up here. This goes similar into the email question. David asked, what restrictions are there about sharing pictures of people on social media? Do we need their permission? Certainly, if you're going to share their face, yes, it's best practice. And also it covers you legally if you get their permission on a waiver to use their photo in communication and purposes. And that, from a personal standpoint, I think is just it's just a good thing to do with your members, so that nobody feels like they're being used as a model without their permission. So get their permission. There's plenty of things available online for permission forms. But this goes back to that idea of, if you're looking at what's legal is always what's best, because it should be what keeps people keeps the individuals in mind to protect them. And so just like with emails, the best thing to do is to get their permission. Certainly with kids, getting their parents' permission is critical. There's lots of reasons why they may not want their kids' pictures online. So never put a photo of a child on any kind of communication without the express written permission of their parent. So yes, not only is that a restriction, but it's also just a good habit. Okay, a couple more as we go through. This one was from the Mount Olive Lutheran Church Facebook account. Do you recommend creating a Twitter account even though it's not necessarily valuable for churches? just to have a presence, and then what kind of posts should we use Facebook promotions on? And that's referring to Facebook ads, I believe. So in terms of Twitter, do I recommend it? Only if you have the time and the audience, which is going to be the answer for most things. There is some value from a search perspective of having a Twitter account, even if it's not necessarily valuable for churches. But having an empty Twitter account is worse than having no Twitter account at all. So if you don't have the time to keep it up to date, certainly don't have a Twitter account. If you don't have the audience that's looking at it, then you may be wasting your time. And unless you're one of those rare people who have lots of time on their hands, then I'd recommend not doing it. It should be based on your audience. And that's the same answer regardless of whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or others. Like I mentioned on our social media time, I would definitely recommend having a Facebook page, because based on statistics alone, the likelihood that your audience on Facebook is very high. If you're not getting engagement, then I would focus on having different posts, and that might be more engaging. With 2 billion people on Facebook, the odds are very high that your audience is going to be on there. And speaking of Facebook, the next question, what kind of posts should we use Facebook promotions on? Certainly to try it, I would recommend on any post, just learn the Facebook ads system, how to boost a post and that kind of thing. More than anything, though, moving forward, I would only spend ad dollars on things that it's really important for you to get the message on. So sharing a Bible verse once a week, I wouldn't boost those, because while it's important to get God's Word into the people's hands and on their screens, it may not be worth the money to do that. It may be worth sharing it yourself and asking others to share it. But if you are doing something like trying to grow your Bible study, and it's a critical goal for your congregation, then that's worth some financial investment, just like it would be worth putting time into. You know, the old phrase, time is money. In many ways, that is very true even in the church, that it'd be better to spend a little bit of money if it saves you time and it expands your reach. So that's not a real clear answer. There's not a clear answer for this. It depends on your situation. But focus on the priority of that communication. How does it help advance your goals? And then I think that it'll become clear whether you should promote it. How much you promote is a very different answer. That depends on your budget and all of that. But certainly, I think the things that are tied directly to your goals and maybe closer to that conversion at the bottom end would be worth putting a little bit of investment behind. All right, so the next step we have here is to answer your questions. And I've gone over the 45 minutes. I do apologize for that. Looks like we've got just a few questions in here. And Julie is asking, and let me read this as I go. Whoops. Okay, good. It is on there. All right, Julie says, we have a new child care ministry for our church. I am finishing up their new website, which is separate from the church. How do I ensure their website is now picked up on Google searches? And another topic, I'll get into that in just a second. So first off, the question about having a child care ministry for the church that's a separate website, it'll depend on your domain first off. If you have a different domain, then you're going to want to go through that same process that you did for your church website. Add Google Analytics to it, set up an account for Google Search Console. In Search Console, you can submit it for indexation. And then it goes into your regular practices of be sure to share content, drive traffic to their website. Those are the kind of things that improve your search engine optimization and the best practice that we talked about in terms of page content. Now, if it's on the same domain, meaning the same website address, just a different directory for your church website, well, that would be that'll be a little bit easier because you already have value built into that domain. Then you can do a lot of those same things. You don't have to do Search Console or Analytics because that's already set up. But sharing the content, making content that people might want to link to, either from sharing on social media or from their blogs, that's going to be the best way. So that would be my recommendation. I know that's not a real thorough answer, But it really just depends. And if you want to jump back in and put whether it's on the same address or a different address, that would be helpful for me too. But it's not going to be too different. If you do it on different addresses, it's going to be like starting over, and that's a decision you may have to make. It'd be starting a new website. You'll have to build up that value. Okay. Let me pull up the second part of that question. And another topic, do I set up separate Facebook page for them or as part of the church Facebook page? That would be, depending on your audience, I would guess it's a slightly different audience because you're probably going after members of the community who may not know your church. And so in that case, I would set it up as a separate Facebook page. Additionally, the kind of content that you're going to share there that's appropriate for that audience will be a little bit different than your church audience. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't post about this childcare ministry on your church's page, but you'd change the message. And that's where you'd say, here, look at what's going on there, as opposed to an invitation to say, we'd love to see your child join us, or registration is open, or here's some of the, here's the open house dates, things like that. So certainly I think that would make sense there to have a different site or a different Facebook page, which is a different kind of strategy from the websites, depending on what your value is. Okay, good. The next thing is from Dave Grimmer from St. Paul Lutheran in Northville, Michigan. The only thing I'm struggling with is how to train people on this. We do not have a focal point person for communications. Communications responsibility is distributed across multiple people, both volunteers and staff. To truly implement this, we'd have to work through this as a team. In general, we are mostly novice with marketing concepts and communication technology. We tend to be a little old school. All right, well, this is where if you don't have dedicated people, you can make this more of a team effort, but make it more about the learning as you go through it. And so if you are not experts in this, you have to learn. And so you can learn together and try different things together. And that's where it can be really fun to experience this as a group. And maybe it's not the whole group each time. Maybe you say, okay, you and I are going to team up this time, and next time you and I are going to team up. As we've learned about live video here, we've had several fun instances of complete failures. We did a communication March Madness bracket back in March, and my coworker Andrew set all that up and got a good system in place. And did well for most of them. There's a couple days he was out, and I jumped in to help with it, and I totally messed up the audio, and we had this repeating loop, and it was really bad. But it was a funny experience now, looking back at it. It was certainly a learning experience because it gave me a chance to dig in and say, okay, what's going on with the audio? How do I learn that? It gave my team the experience of, okay, when there's bad issues going on live, how do we communicate with each other? And so it was certainly a learning experience, and most of these things are so, they're temporary in that the bad doesn't last forever. You're not going to ruin it by having a mistake, but the learning will really improve as you go. So as you roll it out, I would say team up with different people since there's not a point person, or assign 2 different people for this next task. Learn together and separately, but come together and share the learnings so that you as a group can benefit with that. So I'm going to make sure that I answered that thoroughly. Like you said, we have to work as a team. That's the best way that I would recommend, and is just to try these out, have some fun with it. Understand you're not going to get everything right the first time, and be able to laugh at your failures, because you learn much more from your failures than your successes. Because if something bombs, you can much more easily point to the root cause of why it bombed. If something works, you may not know why it worked. It may have been accidental. It may have been because you did this so well this one time. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. But usually when something fails miserably, you can point back to why it did and be able to recover from that from next time. And Julie did mention she's in Elkhorn, Nebraska, Lord of Life and Lord's Lamb's Childcare. So just want to give you a call out for that, and so if others want to look that up, look up your church and your child care and provide advice, they have the resources to do that. So I have I don't think we have any more in the queue. It's kind of a light day, like I said, in the end of August. Things are very busy in the church, and I've already gone over an hour. So I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to those of you who have asked questions before this live broadcast. Let me wrap up with a few last minute helpful things for you. Some of them you've heard before. Our blog, we refer back to that regularly, concordiatechnology.org/blog. There is our post for today. And it's our last post in the series, but continue to tune in. We'll have more posts regularly as we move forward. We post about 2 times a week. There's always things related to technology in the church, and more often than not, they're about communication, but we also do a lot on management too, which certainly you can apply in communication. So there is that. The free download for today is an outline for church online communication strategy. And I'll switch over this PDF real quick just so you can see what's in there. So in the PDF, we talk about all of the things in a very instructional form of what to include in your outline. And it's a summary of all of our previous weeks. And certainly you can still go back and download the free downloads from those previous weeks. And this ties in nicely with our second free download. Let me jump in. So the one that we already showed, that church communication strategy template, is a bonus free download for our last week here. That'll get you started. So you can use these 2 things together. One is your instructions, one is your actual template for getting moving. So the Facebook group that we have will be slowly phasing out. We'll leave it up the group up there for probably about a month. I think I'm going to leave it up there till the end of September and then turn that off, because I don't think we'll monitor it real closely, and I don't want to leave an unmonitored group out there. But we will make sure that there's a link for all the resources. They are available in our, let me switch back over to my Chrome browser real quick. I had the blog post there. We do make the entire selection of free resources available in our resource center, and you can see this here, resources.concordiatechnology.org. Let me zoom in to appropriate level. We have all of our blog posts and our slide decks and our videos in one spot for you. And so we'll be sure to post that link in the Facebook group and also in the email that'll go out for subscribers today. And that way you can always refer back to it. And we have the blog posts will still be there, link into the free downloads. Our YouTube channel has the videos. So there's a number of different ways to get this information. Okay, so the next thing on here, as you know, we are part of Concordia Technology Solutions, and doing this free training has been a lot of fun for me. It is part of what we do here to provide ways to show churches how to leverage technology in their ministry. The difference between this and what we normally do is that we sell a product, or a couple different products in software. Let me switch back to I went to the wrong thing. So what I would recommend you do, if you haven't already, please check out Church 360 Members, our online church management software, 360members.com, and Church 360 Unite, our church website builder. These are great products. We use them in many of our own churches. I've been using Church 360 Members now as an elder, and it's fantastic. As you know, I've mentioned it many times already in this course. I highly encourage you to check this out. This is our business model, and it helps support us so that we can provide these free trainings. So that is my little sales pitch at the end of this. Obviously, you'll have plenty of opportunities to see how to use that as you've reviewed the course. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and thank you for attending these last 14 weeks. It's been a pleasure to share this information with you, to hear back from you on what's valuable and what's not. Please do reach out and contact me with any other questions that you have. I'll get my contact information up there one last time. And if you, as you implement your strategy, if you'd like to share that with me, I'd love to see it. So there's my contact information one last time. Thank you again for participating, and with that, have a great day. Goodbye.